Good morning. Thank you. I appreciate the invitation, and I would like to say also how much we very much appreciate how welcoming you have been to our family when we moved here just a little over 2 years ago. Natchez has just been wonderful to us all, and we truly appreciate it. So thank you very much. You may not have known me very long, but you're probably beginning to catch on that I've spent lots of my life delving through old books, wandering around closed old houses and buildings, and sorting through old trunks and closets, and looking at everything that I could find that I thought would be interesting about the past. Well, in those times, like maybe some of you, I have felt like I honestly was walking in the footsteps of someone that came before me, that I was literally following along in their path, as if there was some giant conundrum and we all step on and we serve our shift, and then we step off to be replaced by others. It's organizations such as the Pilgrimage Garden Club that move that compendium, and it's an important job. So I would like to thank each of the members, both present and in the past, that have devoted so much effort to that. It's an important job, and it's appreciated. So thank you for the invitation today. Today, we're going to talk about research that I have done that's connected to women's diaries and journals. I have sorted through more than 250 Southern women's diaries over my course of research, and the myth and the reality are something that are quite a contrast. So today I thought we'd talk about that. There was a contemporary lingerie ad, maybe some of you remember it, that showed this lady tightly lacing her corset and saying, "Oh, how wonderful, women in the 20th century are moving into middle management." Well, you know what? I think this PR director was about 150 years too late, because ladies in the South had been in middle management for a very long time. They were empowered by default. They were diminished by the popular culture. They worked incredibly hard, and they feigned all knowledge of mundane tasks. They lived in rural isolation, and yet they affected the manners of a society belle. They wanted to portray their role as it was described to them. In these diaries and journals, these ladies relate in their own words how they experienced that world. It is written in their time and in their culture. Unfortunately, popular culture wanted to grab onto just bits and pieces that captured their imagination. So we began to have the romanticized version of the Old South. Probably most people contribute that first stereotypical depiction of plantation life to a work that was called Swallow Barn. It was by John Pendleton Kennedy, and it depicted an agricultural fiefdom that was all centered around a grand white-pillared mansion where daily life was conducted and lived in a world of fantasy and frivolity. Well, obviously, that did cap their imagination. It was very sentimental. It was very romantic. And our fascination with that storyline continues today, as we still could go to a local bookstore and find a book written in that vein. But it really didn't reflect reality. When film began coming along, it added the idea of adding imagery to what was just what we could think of in our imagination as we read a book. So now we have visual images that are stamped on top of the words. This is, of course, Betty Davis in Jezebel. That was one of the most popular early of the Southern Belle movies. And, you know, my favorite scene from Jezebel, if you've ever seen it, I love that she goes off with Henry Fonda, her love, taking him to permanent exile in a leper colony in a Pierrot through the swamps, dressed in a strapless ball gown with full-length opera gloves. So, yeah, really reality. But she won an Academy Award for it, so it worked for her. Then, of course, we have tiny little Margaret Mitchell, who wrote under the name of Margaret Mitchell. Her name was Peggy Marsh, and she brought to us the screen Gone with the Wind as her recollections of the antebellum South. It has become the corporate recollections of society, whether based on what even she meant to be picked up and related. It really wasn't the feisty little Scarlet that was Margaret Mitchell's heroine. She wanted Melanie to be the hero. She was the prototype of the Southern lady that Margaret Mitchell and others of her generation admired, not feisty little Scarlet. But of course, it's scarlet that we all loved. And so the Southern Belle image becomes one of a spoiled and flirtatious and irresponsible little child. And so that's what continues. That becomes till today a strong stereotype of the Southern lady. This is Mary Chesnut, and she has a famous published diary that relates her own life, much more in keeping with what the life of a planter's wife was really like. She represented the requisite of what that image was to be. The planter's wife was to be competent. She was to be calm. She was to be able to take any circumstance as it came along. She was in control, and she made sure everything was running smoothly and happily throughout the entire organization of the plantation community. That's a tall order to fill, and it certainly was one that was not as easily fulfilled as they wanted the image to be portrayed. But this idea of keeping the calm, always being competent, always being a safe place was the role of the planter's wife. I'm always reminded of the glide, which was a popular antebellum stance or dance move, if you want to call it that, where the lady would just glide across the floor, look like she was on ice skates, and go across the floor. One of my favorite memories of visiting pilgrimage here many times in the past is there was a lady, maybe some of you know her, okay, who could do that so beautifully. And she could just, those little feet were going a mile a minute under that hoop skirt, but she just appeared to float effortlessly across the floor. That was the image of the plantation wife that they wanted to portray. And she did it beautifully, and it brought down the house every time. So that was what they wanted. This is Frances Kimball. She was a planter's wife in South Carolina. Her life on that plantation was quite different from what you might imagine. She's a beautiful young woman. She was a former actress, and her diary is fascinating. But she performed what were the tasks assigned to the planter's wife. Well, the planter's wife was supposed to do everything and be in charge of and in control of everything that was not crop related. So, not crop related. Okay, so that will be the supply, the control, the manufacture, the storage, and the distribution of food, clothing, of canning of the fruits and vegetables, tending of the gardens, weaving of the cloth, making of the candles, the care of the animals and the slaughter and the preparation of food from all of the poultry and hogs that were on the plantation, being sure that everybody is supplied, taking care of the sick, taking care of the elderly, being the spiritual guide, and being the counselor for the extended plantation community. It's a very tall order. This is a weaving room, working in a weaving room, weaving cloth to be used. Here is all types of activities taking place just to maintain daily life. And it all had to be supervised. Clothing produced for the vast community that habitated the plantation. Care for the sick was a daunting task. Franny had set up an infirmary there on Butler Island in South Carolina, where she saw patients twice a week. She kept careful records, as the plantation wife kept careful records of everything. And so in that clinic, she recorded in just one day at the clinic that she saw and treated 39 patients. I think that would challenge a modern clinic to see that many. Too often, some of those patients included family members. The mortality rate of children during this period is staggering. Most families saw the majority of their children die before they reached the age of 12. There was funeral after funeral noted in these diaries. There's illness, there's mourning. It's a very sad note that is constant in all of the diaries. There is a really interesting book that was written about a couple of years ago, and is published by the press at LSU, called Necropolis. And it's about yellow fever, and it's about the political and social impact of yellow fever in Louisiana and Mississippi during this time period. And it's an interesting read, and a sad one, but very large-scale replications from that affected lots of lives. The planter's responsibilities, of course, had to do with everything related to the crop, but also property decisions. So everything related to buying things or property was his decisions. And that included the architecture of the house, the design of the gardens, the selection of the furniture, the selection of the drapes, the selection of anything that was bought to decorate the house and grounds, and anything that was purchased as far as fabric for that purpose. There must have been a lot of pillow talk that went on. That would not have happened at my house. I'm sorry. I don't want the drapes my husband picked. But they had them because that was his decision. I'm sure a lot of suggestions were somehow offered. Lots of plantation life was in the country. This is a country setting, and much of it had many barriers, such as bad roads, harsh environments. Frances Kimball related she was so afraid to walk outside her Butler Island plantation that her solo walks outside of her home were limited to 500 yards from her front doorstep because she was afraid of water moccasins and rattlesnakes. So it's much more isolated than one would believe. Now the planter, he wasn't so isolated, but he really couldn't be. These were international businessmen. They had to be in the financial capitals of the world. They had to go to London. They sometimes had to go to Germany. They had to be where the factors were, where they could meet clients, where they could get financial deals, where they could get loans, where they could make all of the business happen to run a large international corporation. Travel was slow, and it took months, so the planters were often away. So the person in charge, left in charge by default, would have been the planter's wife. And her authority was not questioned. It was totally backed that that was the person in charge when he was away. So she was there. She was always welcome to join him, certainly in the social seasons, which were rampant, like here in Natchez or in Savannah or in Charleston. The ladies were always welcomed, and they looked forward to it so much. In these diaries, they would be looking and swapping and trying to get a hold of Godey's and Peterson's magazines to get just little snippets of patterns that they could take to a dressmaker. They would order fabrics. They would go and have fittings. They would be so set to go, and then guess what? Someone was sick. Somebody in the community was sick. There was an outbreak of fever, or one of the children was sick, or she was in mourning, or she was pregnant. Certainly she was not able to travel when she was pregnant. She was doing her confinement. So often they're disappointed at the last minute and they don't get to go. They are often restricted by bad roads or by lack of a chaperone. Ladies absolutely could not travel alone in this time period. And so if you didn't have an adequate chaperone, you could not go. So they were butterflies in a kind of, gilded cage. And they spent much of their time writing certainly to friends that they had made in school, to relatives, to keeping journals, to keeping all of this vast documentation of everything that they used, everything that they ordered, everything that was used up. It's said that that documentation was meant as a paper trail to justify her decision making when the planter came home. She could say, I had to do this because we didn't have this. This is how much we used. This is how much was left. But she spent a great deal of her time in correspondence and journal making. To kind of ease the loneliness of being in an isolated area, they did have neighboring groups that would drum up competitions, such as needlework competition or a quilt competition, and have a little quilt. This is a quilt cup that a lady won, very proudly displayed by her family, because it was just a way of interaction and a way of having something to do and some type of a network of friends, no matter how spread out for her. But these women traveled on. They grew weary. They had the day-to-day industrial-like tasks that grow and grow and grow because they have so many people to take care of and so much production to supervise. They become tired, they become weary, and they became lonely. So depression becomes a serious problem, sometimes with planters' wives. It was often treated with a product called laudanum. Laudanum was an opium derivative, and so there were many ladies that were addicted to opium, and it was a serious addiction of the time, and one that people worried about. worried about why the nerve medicine made people feel so bad and put them so permanently out of the mainstream. Thomas Jefferson even advised his young daughter. He said, no laborious person was ever yet nervous. If you feel nervous, jump from it like a precipice. Find something to direct your activity. Reading, sports, art will all be a respite for you. And to those you could add some utilities such as needlework. He said, the countrywomen of America often have nothing to soothe them but their needle. Well, soothing the country ladies of the South with the needle wasn't necessarily a good panacea. The wives that the planters picked for their brides were often much younger than those in the North. They were some 7 years younger, in fact. And almost all were teenagers, and just mid-teenagers, 15, 16. So they had gone to school. Education for women was highly valued in the South. And so they all went to boarding schools, which turned into the concept of ornamental education flourishes in the 19th century, and those become the finishing schools of the South, where they highlight what we would call sort of a liberal arts curriculum, and it emphasizes music and art and dance, philosophy, needlework, religion. So it wasn't the same type of education the young men received, but it was an education. And their schoolhood friends often were their friends for life. And many of these diaries reflect correspondence and looking so forward to visits from their schoolhood friends. But they were all very young. So to cast a 15-year-old into this role of being a supervisor for a community of several hundred people was a real clash in reality. In school, they had made beautiful samplers and perhaps fancy needlework, and that never prepared them for the sewing tasks that they were about to take on as they joined a plantation group. Minerva Black, who was a plantation wife, reported she and just one helper, Jane, had hand sewed this list of clothing in just 1 week. I realized you're not going to be able to read this from a far distance, so let me help you out. 20 Lovell shirts for men with all felled seams. 30 Lindsay dresses, all the seams backstitched. 43 boys' shirts and pants. 18 coats for men, all lined 4 yards each per coat with large collars and 4 worked buttonholes. 24 sacks for small boys, 36 women's chemises, and 48 pants for small boys. That's quite a week. That was quite a week. There was a young Bayusera woman who wrote her mother and said, I have more than 2 months of sewing to do. I've never been so tired of sewing in my life. I feel like my fingers are going to fall off. Almost all was hand sewn. The sewing machine was invented, 1830s. It was never widely distributed in the South till after the Civil War. So almost all of this was done by hand. And if you look at some of those sewing techniques, like a fell seam, it takes 3 seams. So, it's an incredible amount of hand sewing. But it pales in the sight of the knitting. Knitting would daunt the most industrious planter's wife. They never purchased knitted goods. Now, they did purchase cloth. It was considered too time-consuming to weave the cloth. And the planters didn't want time tied up in making cloth that took away from production in the field. So they would order cloth. They would order cloth to be made for enslaved persons' clothing in vast quantities, from some 100 to 1,000 barrels per order, came in barrels. And they got it from London, and they got some from Germany, some from the West Indies. It was unbleached. It was Cassinade and Osenberg and Drugget. Those were fabrics that were not used to make fashionable dress, so they were discriminatory by choice, but they were very strong. They were almost always unbleached in color. But so those were ordered, never knitted goods. Knitted goods were not added. They were made. And this one mistress says, okay, in fact, it was Mary Junkin, and she says, we have already made 20 of the 40 pairs of socks that we need for this season. One sock takes 185 stitches per row. If I work diligently all day, I can knit 150 rows. So in 6 days, I can make one sock. I can make a pair in about 2 weeks. We lead at least 2 pair per person per season. I don't think she ever got through knitting. I don't think. The clothing was simple, it was strong, it was quick to make, but there was just a lot of it, and it had to be replaced. It was usually worn until it turned into just rags or made into rags. The quality of the fabric was so coarse that they were made out of bast fibers for the most part. That's the stemmy wood of a plant. And so there are accounts of brothers telling their sisters, thank you, they're telling their older brothers that had passed down a hand-me-down shirt, thank you for breaking in the sticks of my shirt. Now it's more comfortable. You have worn it until it's more comfortable. As the war progressed, or just leading up to the war, scarcity in the Strangled South became a reality. Prices were sky high. Prices were high before war broke out because everything was imported. So they had to pay double duty on having most of the manufacturing in the North or in Europe. But after the war broke out, the prices were not only high, but there was nothing to be bought. One of the Planters' Wives reports, I'm doing pretty well. I sold my pink silk dress for $600, and I'm selling the butter and eggs for $200. She says, doesn't that sound like a lot? She said, I can get part of it every 2 weeks, but what am I paid for? What's paid for it? Confederate money. It's not worth anything. It's worthless. So the economy begins to drag slowly, more and more, forcing an economy of scarcity to exist. Prices were incredible. Boots such as this could be $800 to $1,000 if you could get them at all. Ladies in Charleston began to be so frugal with their use of their shoes that they made shoe bags. And they would put their shoes in the bag, and then they wore what they called booties made out of sweetgrass rush, like they make the baskets out of. They would wear those little booties. They got to their destination, they'd take off the booties, put those in the bag, take their shoes out of the bag, wear those just in the house, repeat the process when they left, because there were no replacements. Butter was $8 a pound. I think it's going to be there pretty soon for us too, but butter was $8 a pound. Chickens were $8. Pork was $6 to $8 a serving, and it was almost impossible to get. Chicken was priced at $8. So scarcity was certainly a reality. Life certainly changed as war broke out. This, of course, is Nottoway. I'm sure lots of you have been to Nottoway. The Randolph family lived at Nottoway. The journal of Patricia Randolph is fascinating. As war began to break out, her father took lots of the workers, all of the workers from Nottoway, some of the good furniture, all of the good china and silver, and took them all to Texas and established another plantation there, leaving his wife, Mrs. Randolph, in charge of Nottoway with the children, in the hopes of if they were captured or they tried to occupy Nottoway, their presence would assuage the people and it would be saved. It worked. He also hired coolie workers. I think that's interesting. Coolie workers to stay there and help on the plantation. But it did work. The officer that came to occupy Nottoway had been entertained there before the war in a social context, and he knew the Randolphs. And of course, they were glad to see him. They were very kind to him, and he tried to pay back those courtesies. He did occupy Nottoway, but he did not burn it. And Mrs. Randolph was asked to leave, which she, in that calm, competent way, said, okay. That house is famous for 365 windows and doors, one for every day of the year. She had that huge key ring with a key to every one of them hanging from it. She went to window, door to door, locked every one of them, turned when she got to the front door, locked the front door, walked across that front lawn and boarded a steamboat, never looked back, never blinked, left her home of 30 years and stepped on the steamboat and sailed away. Now, they did recover. They never recovered Nottoway, but they did recover in other senses. But other places, of course, had a very harsh story during the war. Certainly, Vicksburg has a different tale to tell than we have here in Natchez, It was under siege. Nothing was coming in or out of Vicksburg. This is the famous wallpaper newspaper that some of you may have seen in the museum in Vicksburg. The newspapers were vital links to everyone. That's the way they got their information. So they tried to continue to publish it throughout the war. But ink was $60 an ounce. And so very hard to find anything to even print. And they certainly weren't going to have enough leftover cloth to turn it into newsprint. So there was no paper to print it on. So they used anything they could find. And so they printed that newspaper on accounting sheets, on ledger sheets, and some of the most famous is on the back side of wallpaper, where they printed several editions just to get the news out. This is Balfour House in Vicksburg. Emma Balfour has a wonderful diary where she describes living through the siege in Vicksburg and hearing the shells go off all day long. And then at night, she and some of the other women would take the children, take them into the caves that are in the bluffs outside of Vicksburg so that they could sleep all night safely, and they would spend the night in the caves. In the morning, bring the children back out so they could at least have some activity and play where they could see what was going on and protect them there. So the ladies of Vicksburg fought a valiant struggle. In her diary, she says that when a referendum was circulated asking for the surrender of the city, it received only 3 signatures. And Emma says they discounted the strength of the women of Vicksburg. So it fell, of course, on January the 1st. As the war drags on, they begin to have other types of scarcities, and those are scarcities of manpower. In the northern states, it was possible to bring new recruits from immigrants that came in. If you ever saw the movie Gangs of New York, it has a great depiction of that, where they have recruiting booths right beside where the boats are coming in bringing immigrants from Europe. And so they recruit and say, you can get a place to stay, meals, a salary, a job, right here, just sign up, and would enlist in the Union troops. In the Strangle South, there was no resource for bringing in extra manpower. So the conscription age had to change. In 1861, the ages were 16 to 60. Towards the end of the war, 1863, the ages were 9 to 74. 3 generations of men were lost in that war, on both sides. Many people lost friends and family. They had friends and family fighting on both sides, and they lost extensive numbers of those people. The current estimate is that there were 760,000 deaths in the Civil War, more military deaths than in all other wars that this country has ever fought. So that certainly becomes a reality for women as they try to maintain. The goal of the Southern woman was to maintain. She did not initiate, she maintained. Well, after the Civil War, she was left to maintain alone. But she takes up that task. Certainly, families are in deep mourning. They have lost almost 3 generations, so many remain alone for a long time. But they continue to maintain. They had to maintain through Reconstruction. They had to maintain through the boll weevil, which comes and destroys the cotton of the whole South, covers the whole South by 1927, only to usher in the Great Depression. So several generations of Southern women maintained alone. And yes, much of it was lost. Much of it was lost to time. Much of it was lost to decay, inability to maintain these properties with no money, no manpower. But still, they went on. They maintained what they could. They had no monetary means to certainly remodel or update or change. One diary says, we might have remodeled to ranch or even Art Deco, but there was just no money. So they just maintained what we had. And today, ironically, it's that abject poverty that has brought us architectural treasures and aesthetics to the now time-recovered and time-reverent South. But as this lady holds on, she really holds on, and she holds on to the remnants of her family and her family's legacy. even tighter than she once laced that corset. So here's to the ladies that maintained, and are we thankful that she maintained it? Let us do them justice in continuing their fight. Thank you.